Einsley Beaumont, a renowned bio-geneticist, tipped his glasses back down his nose, catching the gleam of the early morning sun. His heart drummed in his chest as he watched the steel doors of his lab, his very own sanctum of curiosity, slide open. His protégé, a brilliant young scientist named Lyle, followed close behind, cradling an object swathed in a protective cloth in his arms. "It is done, then?" Einsley strained for calmness. He already knew the answer. He had always known the answer, from the very second he'd embarked on this venture. Lyle nodded, held out the ominous figure carefully, a reverence in his actions. "Meet Gerard, your identical clone." With a ginger touch, Einsley drew back the cloth, revealing an uncanny replica of himself. As he studied the clone, he felt an eerie numbness pool in his stomach. This was him, down to the freckles dotting his skin, and the silver strands that streaked through his hair. But it was lifeless, yet to be awakened. Taking a breath to numb the sensation, Einsley reached into his pocket and pulled out an intricate device. It was small, barely larger than a thimble, packed with microcircuitry and humming with the potency of the breakthrough it encapsulated. Transmission of human consciousness. The next hour etched a milestone in the annals of history, a hushed secret shared only by Einsley, Lyle, and the empty austerity of their concealed lab. As Einsley activated the device, a wave of neural energy surged from him into the dormant clone. His vision blurred, creating a dual image that felt at once different and yet the same. And then, in the cold, metallic quiet, Gerard opened his eyes. Einsley's eyes, Einsley's voice, Einsley's mind, encapsulated within an uncanny doppelganger. The clone turned to look at the awestruck Lyle, then finally at Einsley, and whispered, "Are you me, or am I you?" Einsley stuttered, processing the intensity of their shared consciousness. He could, in a way he couldn't explain, feel what Gerard was feeling. Their minds, soaked in the other's perception, echoed the same thoughts in unison. A profound understanding dawned on Einsley. He had not only created a clone, he had created a vessel, a conduit to lead a double life. He could attend a scientific gala across the globe, or navigate dangerous experiments while working endlessly on newer breakthroughs, all simultaneously. Einsley shivered, not with fear, but with anticipation. The infinite potential of this technology lay bare before him, promising revolutionary strides in the realm of science, and yet, held within his grasp, a deeply personal means of becoming something more than just him, an amplifier of his existence. Einsley spent the next few weeks teaching Gerard to navigate through the world as his duplicate. Einsley, in his lab, toiling away at his numerous pursuits, and Gerard, maneuvering through Einsley's demanding social commitments and handling his worldly affairs. However, as Einsley continued existing as two entities, he began to sense an impending storm. The split between himself and Gerard started taking a toll on him slowly and surely. The fatigue was intensifying, his mind felt strained and stretched too thin, and worst of all, Gerard began to show signs of becoming more than a mere duplicate. He was displaying unique personality traits, and his simultaneous existence with Einsley was causing an involuntary melding of memories and experiences. Faced with the growing conflict, Einsley realized the gravity of his reality. The split consciousness wasn't favoring him as much as he had anticipated. The boundaries defining him and Gerard were beginning to blur, and the threads holding his carefully structured world were beginning to fray. The world outside the lab seemed to darken slightly as a grim foreboding crawled up Einsley's spine. His clone, Gerard, had begun to function independently. Distinct traits and independent thought processes, contradictory to Einsley's own, had begun to surface. More alarmingly, Gerard had begun to question his existence. Einsley knew something had to be done, but for the moment, he was at a loss. Lyle had been a pillar of strength, examining the data, helping Einsley sort through calculated leaps of logic and emotional turmoil that assaulted them both. At the heart of their worries was the question of sustainability. How long could they navigate this split existence before the adverse effects became unbearable? Despite the unease gnawing at him, Einsley sent Gerard on his many escapades, meetings to attend, risky equations to balance, numerous tasks that kept the original Einsley anchored in his lab, relentlessly fueling his research. Despite the disquiet, Einsley acknowledged the practicality of the situation, admitting that the intellectual prowess of two Einsleys was better than one. Yet, with each passing day, his mental health deteriorated. Disturbing bouts of disorientation began to replace his usual bouts of clarity. His workspace was cloaked in a dizzying mirage, his thoughts both his own and not his own. Echoes of Gerard's experiences haunted his mind, entangling him in a web of shared thoughts and emotions. When Einsley voiced his concerns to Lyle, his loyal protégé advised a potential solution, a form of amalgamation, a merging of their split consciousness. It was a risk, one that would either solve all their problems or end catastrophically, creating an irrevocable rupture in Einsley's mental stability. The repercussion weighed heavily against Einsley's decision. He decided it was worth the risk. After all, his life had always been nothing but a series of calculated risks. Every discovery, every accomplishment was born out of daring hypotheses and daring actions. This action was no different. With a heaving sigh, Einsley agreed to the plan. However, what he hadn't anticipated was the difficulty of the process. His and Gerard's lives had spun off several weeks apart. Unique experiences and memories had begun to intertwine, creating a fabric of existence that both were and weren't Einsley's. This made the task of merging back infinitely complex. Their plan: Einsley would hook himself and Gerard up to the same device that had split their consciousness. Under Lyle's wary supervision, they would attempt to map their neural networks back into one, effectively undoing the split of consciousness. Every calculation seemed precise, every variable accounted for, but as Einsley looked into the mirror that was Gerard, hesitation crept in. Would he revert back to his former self, or would he adopt some parts of Gerard's unique experiences? And if he did, would he still be Einsley Beaumont, renowned bio-geneticist, inventor, scientist, or someone else entirely? Unanswered questions spiraled around him as he faced an uncertain reflection of himself. Embarking on this desperate journey of reclamation, Einsley could only hope the blending would make him more than the sum of two halves. The dim hum of machines provided a muted soundtrack as Einsley and Gerard lay side by side, their heads crowned with a complex net of wires and electrodes. The quiet panel of lights on the console flickered like the heartbeat of their experiment, pulsating softly. Lyle moved between the two stations, his gaze flickering over the readouts. An air of stoic silence held them as they teetered on the precipice of undiscovered scientific marvel, or potentially chaos. With a final nod from Lyle, Einsley activated the device. A momentary shudder passed through him as a soft tingling sensation sparked at the base of his skull, quickly spreading outward like a wave. As the neural pathways opened, memories flooded back in visual flashes, echoing laughter, moments of triumph, shared conversations. Each image slipped through his own like ghostly apparitions. As Einsley braced himself, taking quick, measured breaths, the connection manifested more tangibly. Like a puzzle being assembled rapidly, memories slotted together in rapid succession. His consciousness, strained as it already was, struggled to accommodate the dual imagery. He could see himself in the lab, could also see through Gerard's eyes, the view shifting as if he were in two places simultaneously. But then, the shift he had been anticipating began. He felt it rather than saw it, an ebbing pull, as if he were being drawn from one side of his mind to the other. With a spiraling rush, Gerard's consciousness began to seep into Einsley, filling him with memories and experiences he had never personally lived. Einsley panicked, his body convulsing on instinct. A sharp cry escaped his lips as he fought to keep up with the onslaught of conflicting information. The edges of reality blurred as he tried to grapple an anchor in the runaway rush of sensations. All he could hear was blood rushing in his ears and the rhythmic pound of his heart. As the last strands were reluctantly retreating, Einsley felt a familiar presence. He turned towards the memory, a conference, the clink of glasses, an interesting conversation with a fellow scientist. Einsley never attended any conference recently. He then realized, with sudden clarity, that it was Gerard's memory. Einsley's apprehension turned to amazement. He had expected to regain his original self, but instead he was becoming a combination of his and Gerard's existences. It was a struggle, an intense conflict of identities, but amidst the storm, Einsley began to realize that he was not being diluted. He was evolving. Two lives, two sets of experiences were weaving together, building a consciousness that was not merely a leap, but a stride into an uncharted domain of existence. As the last strands of Gerard's consciousness pulled away and swept into Einsley, the myriad of electrodes connecting them went slack. Einsley lay panting, the last dregs of energy spent. As he opened his eyes, he was instantly assaulted by the harsh light of his lab. But with it came relief. The duality had ceased. For the first time in weeks, he was back to being in one place, one mind, one consciousness. Yet, he wasn't the same. He was more. He was Einsley and Gerard, an embodiment of shared lives, shared memories, a common past, and a unified present. The lab descended into silence once again. Lyle, calculating and efficient as always, was already peeling off the cold nodes from Einsley's skin. He loosened the restraints that held Einsley and Gerard, his face betraying no emotion, but there was an undercurrent of apprehension in his movements. Einsley sat up, 1,000 thoughts swirling in his mind. They were mostly his thoughts, and yet not entirely so. Thoughts and experiences that had been birthed from Gerard peppered his cognition, making his perception richer, more amplified. It was exhilarating, almost overwhelmingly so. As he slowly got up, Einsley intended to move towards Gerard, but then he stopped, frozen by what he saw. Gerard, his clone, was lying immobile, his gaze hazy, unfocused. But then he blinked, his gaze clear and cognizant, and scooted up into a sitting position. With bated breath, Einsley watched as Gerard's gaze fell upon him, mirrored eyes regarding each other. But the expected sense of shared consciousness didn't come. Gerard was silent, looking at Einsley curiously, as if he was a puzzle to be solved. With the twist of reality sinking into his understanding, Einsley thundered towards the unnerving realization. He reached out a shaky hand, touching the cool palm of Gerard. The familiar shared flow of thoughts and experiences was conspicuously absent, as Gerard regarded him quizzically. Einsley staggered back, his mind in turmoil. It seemed the merging procedure had not gone according to plan. Instead of simply reclaiming his consciousness as expected, he had absorbed Gerard's as well. Closing his eyes, Einsley plunged inward, seeking answers in the pool of memories that now inhabited him. He found a cluster of thoughts that felt foreign, experiences steeped in novelty. Slowly, he untangled a startling thread, memories related to a past conference, diplomatic smiles, curious queries from fellow researchers. All experiences he never lived firsthand, but were lived through Gerard. His eyes flew open as the lights flickered overhead. He looked at Gerard, who was watching him with a peculiar interest. His original assumption was entirely wrong. He wasn't the duplicate. And like a tumbling row of dominoes, the truth came crashing down. The original Einsley, Gerard Beaumont, had retreated into the clone's body during the procedure, safeguarding his research and life's work. The memories he had seen, the events, the subtly altered perceptions and decisions, were not from the clone. They were experiences of the real Einsley through the life of the clone, who was, in reality, himself. Einsley had switched their identifiers from the very beginning. The clone was the original, and Gerard his actual self. The cloned Einsley now held not just his original consciousness, but those of Gerard's as well. He was the summation of two minds, two bodies of experience. He was an embodiment of Einsley Beaumont and his clone. He was more than he could ever be, more than Einsley Beaumont, and even more than his clone, Gerard. The truth was stark, challenging, and profound. It was illogical, improbable, and yet all too real. And for Einsley, it was just the beginning. A suffocating silence swept over the lab. Einsley, or rather, the man who had been living as Einsley, felt his world tilt. The familiar surroundings became alien in the light of the shocking revelation. His cloned self, the man he considered Gerard, stared at him blankly, struggling to grasp the implications of their switched identities. Their stirring silence, however, did not last. Like cracks in a dam, determination surged through Einsley, whirling him into action. So what if their identities switched? It didn't fundamentally change anything. He was Einsley Beaumont once, and he still was, only different. He had burgeoned into something far more complex, living through dual layers of existence. He was Einsley, and he was the clone, two versions of himself bound by the threads of a single consciousness. Turning those revelations over in his mind, Einsley moved towards the console. His fingers flew across the slick surface, inputting commands that would shut down the energy field encasing Gerard's limp body, systematically reversing the procedure. By now, he was entrusting his actions to instinct, driven by the predicament and the need to act, moving with the haunting prowess of both his personas. With the final deactivation click, Gerard's body, drained of its former life force, was truly just an empty shell, a sculpted monument to the man he was and the man he had become. That night, Einsley stood by the window of his lab, overlooking the sprawl of the city, his mind a tempest of thoughts. Lyle had left a while back, leaving Einsley alone. He was different, transformed, evolved, and yet he was wholly himself. Einsley Beaumont, the scientist, and the man. In the heart of it all, the revelations had not weakened him. They had empowered him. They had given him a fresh lens through which he could perceive his existence. His being was testament to the journey of a scientist and his clone, their accomplishments, their conflicts, and their beautiful shared complexity. In the end, Einsley realized that the switch, the blend, had not been a conflict. It was harmonious, opening doors to unexplored parts of his existence, allowing him to tread in uncharted territories of scientific discovery and humanity. He had started as Einsley Beaumont, the scientist with a vision, ended up as Gerard, the scientist with a greater depth, molded from the experiences of both him and his clone. Through the journey's end, he was both, and yet more so. Despite the double identity, Einsley did not feel a sense of loss or identity crisis. Instead, an irreversible evolution. He was his own version, unique, irreplaceable, and comfortingly familiar. From Einsley to Gerard and back to Einsley, but an enlightened version, he endured. As the dawn began to break, Einsley turned to face the lab. The silence wasn't dreadful. Rather, it held a comforting resonance. Whatever had transpired hadn't robbed him of his identity, instead had gifted him a richer one. His gaze swept across the room, finally resting on the shell of his clone, the harbinger of his evolution. Despite the chaos of discovery and the travails of transformation, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clarity that would drive his future endeavors. He was the culmination of two lives, two pasts, two realities, two paths merged into one. In the reflection of the quiet echoes of a night that upended his life, Einsley found himself, truly, irrevocably himself. The scientist and the clone, in perfect harmony. With the break of dawn came his personal era of enlightenment. For Einsley, a challenging journey found its end, and a new epoch of exploration began.